So, Andrew, I love apocalyptic fiction, and there's one particular story that I love called Station 11. And there's a part in that story where people are looking at these devices that are completely black and wondering, what they were for the generations that came after them. And it made me think, as I was reading that book and then watching the series, how do we preserve our stories and our language for the future, thousands and thousands of years into the future? If anything were to happen where our tech went, what would we actually do? And that led me to a search to finding the amazing things that you're doing. And it's an absolute honor to speak to you today. And for anybody that doesn't know, who you are or what you do, it'd be great to just have a little bit of an introduction and a personal doorway into what you do and what your mission is.
Of course. Thanks for having me. My name's Andrew Warner. I'm Special Project Director at the Long Now Foundation. We're a nonprofit focused on fostering long-term thinking and continuity over the last 10,000 years and the next 10,000 years, which is a sort of 20,000 year period of time we call the Long Now. I've been here 13 years and I've worked on a variety of projects during that time. Right now, I'm focused on the Rosetta Project, the Manual for Civilization, and Long Bets, which are three of our programs. The question of how do you preserve information into the far future is one that when we started, that wasn't our original mission. We basically started around this idea of a 10,000 year clock, which is a monumental timepiece that's a sort of symbol of long-term thinking to inspire people, to get people to take seriously, these long-term future. Clock will be around in 10,000 years. Like, will humans, will they, what will they think about our generation? Will they think we've been good ancestors? These are the types of questions we want to push to the front of the conversation. And while we were building the clock, which is still under construction, 30 years, we also started to think about what a library that went along with the clock would look like, and started to really get into this idea of a 10,000 year library. So we were like, okay, what would a 10,000 year library, if we found one today, be like? If we found, some, Dead Sea Scroll equivalent, some amazing archive of writing from deep time. God, let's be let out. If we found this amazing archive, and immediately we realized that we would basically not be able to read it in all likelihood, right? It's like all information is encoded at different levels. And this can range from extreme encoding down to very simple encoding. And the simplest level of encoding is language, right? So all this information is sorted into a set of, symbols, either written or, verbal, and we use those to communicate. But if you don't understand the code, none of that information transfers.
No.
Now, that's the simplest version. Now, if you look at something like, Andy Warhol's early, like computer, graphic design artworks, that is so many layers of encoding. So you have to, you have a very specific version of a very specific piece of software that only runs on a very specific type of operating system, that only runs on a specific type of computer that's from the 60s, 70s, that runs on these, ancient pieces, all of them which were only designed to run for, 5 years, 10 years, maybe 20 if you're lucky, but not the 40, 50, 60 years that we're now looking that we need to construct this. And all of those computers are reliant upon extremely specialized knowledge of how to repair, how they work. So, functionally, these are within this sort of multi-onion layers of encoding. What we started to realize when we started to think about a 10,000 year library, so we started to look at our current time and said, oh my God, we're being told we live in an age of information. In all likelihood, this is probably going to be a digital dark age. Um, and that
Yeah.
was a term that sort of, uh, we had a conference in 1998. Um, and that term had been in this sort of academic paper a couple years before, but we hosted this whole conference time in bits to be like, what's going on here? And Rooster Kale, who started the Internet Archive, was there. He was also thinking about this, like who's going to archive the web? This is the most amazing sort of information resource humanity has produced, and no one's thinking about um, how to preserve it for the future. And so we sort of accidentally found ourselves in the digital archiving world of being a proponent of really getting this concept out there, the digital dark age, that a lot of our cultural resource, a lot of our shared um, cultural understanding are now mediated through often corporate entities that don't have much of a responsibility to the users. And we see this all the time, like major gaming platforms from which people developed massive social networks that span the globe will just go under and just turn off all their servers and all the data will be lost. And if it wasn't for organizations like our partner, the Internet Archive, none of that information would be saved at all. It's a very long answer to your.
No, oh, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. And whilst you're talking there, I think there's a little bit of lore that needs to be explained in this word Rosetta. Now, I understand, being a geek of the ancients and ancient history, I understand that term, that name, and where that comes from. But if you're just able to share the kind of the connection to that name.
Yeah. So we started to take seriously this idea of a 10,000 year library and realizing that our first task before we could even start collecting books or thinking about how long it's going to be stored and all that was this information encoding problem, from which the fundamental issue is language. And we gained a lot of inspiration from the story of the Rosetta Stone. So the Rosetta Stone was found by Napoleon's soldiers. And up until that point, hieroglyphics hadn't been deciphered, which is strange to think about because we all grew up in a time when we can read hieroglyphics, but for thousands and thousands of years, Egyptologists were wandering around these huge monumental pyramids and tombs, saying, "Wow, seems like there's a language here. Too bad we don't understand any of it." It was all just meaningless. We didn't have any cipher, any way to to break it. And Napoleon's soldiers found this one piece of stone, and the amazing thing it had was parallel text. So it had the same text in three different languages, one of them being Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, what's funny about this is the content of the text doesn't really matter at all. It was a tax code. It was about as boring of a piece of document as you could possibly imagine. Um, but the fact that it had the same text allowed linguists to sit down and it took a long time, but eventually decipher it and break open this entire language and this entire culture, all these stories, all this meaning, thousands of years of history. And so we were like, oh, what if we could build a Rosetta Stone that could unlock basically the civilization we have now? Um, you know, and this example is kind of tongue in cheek because we're explicitly not an apocalyptic organization, but the concept is, you know, if you were to find yourself in some post-apocalyptic future and you found yourself at the Library of Congress or, like the British Museum or one of these massive archives and you had one of these discs and you spoke one of the 2,500 languages that is recorded on these discs, that in theory, with enough time and enough study, you could understand all 2,500 languages that are on the disc. Um, and I'll give the caveat again. It's like we're explicitly not an apocalyptic
Right.
organization. It's like we're not like, oh yeah, I'm really gonna need this in Mad Max time. That's why we're building this. Um, it's more that concept creates a really interesting design constraint.
Mm.
And there's this beauty of building things for the future that forces us to confront truths about our current time and our current humanity.
Mm.
So the best metaphor I like to give is the Voyager records, right? So, we sent out these records on the Voyager missions, and Carl Sagan built these beautiful golden
The golden
records
disc.
along with, yeah, the golden discs. And it had, um, recordings from around Earth and had, whale songs and, new babies' cries and songs and people speaking different languages. And, you know, do we think there's a high likelihood that aliens are going to find the Voyager craft and be like, oh, wow, this is a really good record of humanity? Probably not. But was it a really important exercise of understanding what it means to be human or what it means to live on planet Earth and what it means to have like interstellar responsibility or like not blowing ourselves up in a nuclear war? Like the cultural impact of that disc is much more important as an artifact that allows us to look back on ourselves.
Agreed. Although some people say with the dark forest theory that we shouldn't be doing that type of thing. We shouldn't be sharing that type of information out there. But anyway, that we digress. That's a different conversation. But so it's this notion of why language matters if tech fails, and that we assume in our ignorance in the future people can read hard drives, but that actually that meaning is not guaranteed. And I love your notion here of this digital dark age. I think about the dark ages that went before and the sort of dropout of information in that period of time. There's a real threat and danger within this period of time that it could be a digital dark age where lots of information gets lost. So this understanding, and you've alluded to what actually this is that you're creating, is this difference between storing data and preserving readability, right?
Mhm.
So it's not just data storing, you're actually preserving readability that can be decoded if there is a thread into the past of a language that once was. So I guess what I'd love to move on to now is, what is it? So there must have been a huge amount of thought that went into how to solve that problem. So how did you come to that, and what is it we're talking about here?
Yeah, so the Rosetta disk is the physical artifact that resulted from this project. And it's a 3.5 inch um, uh, nickel disc, and it's micro etched. So it's using the same technology that's used to write on computer wafers and silicone, but it's writing text at a level of magnification that if one had sort of Renaissance era optics technology, if one could design simple curved glass magnification, the type of stuff you see with like Spinoza or Galileo, then you could really um, read it. So that was really crucial. You think about the example of Andy Warhol's early early computer and all of the layers of encoding. All of this requires is the technology that's over 500 years old to read. And so we have these different pages on the disk itself. So if you look at the disk, you'll see that it looks like there's kind of glitter on one side. And if you look really closely and you grab a magnifying glass out, you'll see that that glitter is actually pages of text. So crucially, it's not ones and zeros, it's human eye readable encoded information.
What?
Yeah. So, that we sort of tried to sidestep some of the digital dark age stuff like that to say, no, don't need your computer. This isn't in a specific language. You just need to be able to speak one language of the 2,500 that are here. And then there's the big question of what do you put on the disk?
Yeah, that's what was going to be my next question.
So, being inspired by the Rosetta Stone, the big thing we realized we needed was basically a parallel text. We needed a text that was in as many languages as possible. We looked around, we tried to find different ones. Can you guess what we figured out as the most widely translated text in the world?
Oh gosh, I've got drawn a blank. What? What?
There's the Bible.
Oh, okay. Of course. Right. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Yes.
Yeah. So we ended up finding this org called the Linguistics Summer Institute, or the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And linguists kind of had this love-hate relationship with this org because it's a Christian missionary org that
Right.
goes around the world learning languages and then translating the Bible into that language so we can save the people from that culture, which of course is a sort of very problematic colonialist concept. It's like the very act of preserving the culture is an act of destroying it through like colonization of our religion. So, linguists don't love it. However, they had the funding to be able to do really important linguistic work with a lot of endangered languages that otherwise may not have been recorded or documented. So um, they had a lot of languages, and especially really rare and endangered languages. So there's around 7,000 languages on the planet. We got 2,500 of them onto the disk. Linguistic diversity is a really important and unfortunately complicated issue. Um, you know, m- Most linguists think that somewhere between 97 to 99% of languages will be functionally extinct by the end of this
Yeah.
century.
Yes.
There might be some people who speak it, but not like large generative linguistic communities. Um, and it's a complicated issue because, there's often more economic opportunity if you speak the more, dominant colonialist language. Um, and there's good reasons why people, are push their kids away from their, historic or um, family language. Um, Being said, it's linguistic diversity is like it's just like biodiversity. Like it is one of our cultural and like it's like one of the heritages of the world. Like it is a beautiful thing. And a lot of people think of languages as just uh systems of symbols, right? It's like, oh, a rose is a rose by any other name. It doesn't really matter what language you're saying. It's all just a symbol for the same thing. which has some truth to it. But there's also really important ways in which languages store cultural knowledge for a specific area.
Yes.
So there's fascinating research that shows once an area loses its local language, and the generation after, you tend to lose a lot of the biological diversity in that area too.
Wow.
Yeah, and the theory there is that basically when you can name something, you understand its use, you understand its importance. So like I didn't grow up in a jungle. If I go in a jungle and wander around, I'm like, vine, tree. It's like my language for understanding what's there is very rudimentary.
Mm.
Versus if you're somewhere that can go back hundreds of generations in the same jungle, it's like each of those vines has, a story tied to it and a myth that like hints at its medicinal value or why one should stay away from it or, if it's a poison. And so there's so much cultural knowledge embedded in these languages, and it's really important to basically for both cultural reasons and for biological reasons.
Yes, gosh, that's so fascinating that we're talking about story in this season, right? So what we're saying there is that story is loaded into language because of the ancient history of that language and how it developed. And the environment that you grew up in directly influences the language that developed and the stories that are loaded within that language. And so if we lose a language from a particular area, we're also losing so much more than that. We're losing so much knowledge, culture, just, thousands and thousands of years of built in information that can be completely lost with the language. Gosh, that's so incredibly powerful. So, what I'm understanding here is that it's language that is being preserved. It's not the history of the human race that's being preserved. There are other elements to that, I'd imagine, the Internet Archive and things like that.
Yeah, so this is really focused on that first level of encoding. So we have parallel texts. We also have something called Swadesh lists. These are lists of words put together by linguists of words that exist in every language. So some of them you'd expect, like mom and dad, but other than like sneeze. Yeah, every language has a word for sneeze. Yeah, it's a word you need. Um, and so we have vocab lists. We also have stories in that language. So, like founding myths, which is nice because the part of the Bible that's our most widely translated text is Genesis 1, um, which was large, but also metaphorical reasons. Functionally, uh, they didn't always finish translating the Bible. So they always started there. Um, and also, if you don't speak a language, it's a lot easier to photograph the first few like pages rather than trying to find a specific area of the Bible. But also, metaphorically, it's the creation myth, right? It's like this beautiful, like, what are the stories that we tell about ourselves? Where do we think we came from?
Mm.
Which also translates nicely to the other stories of where we think we came from these other languages, like their creation myths. We also have grammars and like descriptions of the language themselves. So grammars that might take, decades for a linguist to figure out, you can write out in like, one page or half a page and
Right, right.
you know, the subject verb object order or like, how prefixes and suffixes work or something. And tenses. Um, so it's sort of a range of linguistic um data. And yeah, the concept is that if you have this disk, then you could decode the language and then hopefully there'll be some other information out there in the world. This won't be the only object.
Yeah, right.
But other, libraries, monuments, archives could now start to become accessible.
Mm. I made some notes in terms of thinking what gets lost, which you powerfully described in terms of that example of being in the jungle and the language developed in the jungle. But I made a note here. So it's personal identity in how a community sees itself. It's cultural memory, so myth, oral forms, rituals, humor, those sorts of nuance. And then it's practical knowledge, like land, ecology, medicine, navigation, those sorts of things that have the potential to just completely drop off the face of the earth, right? So I'm sitting with one of these discs in front of me in the future, having found it wherever it's. That's another question I'll ask in a minute. Where do I find this? But it's micro etched on nickel. I need some kind of magnifying glass to see it.
So this is one of my favorite parts about the disc. So on one side, what you'll see is a bunch of languages sort of spiraling in from, human eye readable level to smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then the other side, it just looks like, glitter, just has all the pages. So it goes down smaller, smaller, and smaller. And what I love about this is it's really hard to communicate something to someone for which you share no symbolic language with. So in researching the Rosetta disk, we did this whole detour through nuclear waste storage because that was where a lot of the research had been of how do you communicate 10,000 years into the future when you don't share any, shared symbolic language. And there's been fascinating government studies that go into that of being like, how is this possible? This is an aside, but basically it's extremely difficult. Like it may not be possible to communicate like don't go here. Because you think about stuff like the ancient Egyptians, it's like they put as many warnings as you can possibly put on it, right? Like, do not enter, curse upon thee for 1,000 generations. First thing people say is like, we're definitely going in there. It's like, probably your best bet is just to hide it really, really well. Don't announce it. Don't try and warn people. Although my favorite solution they came up with was something called the 𝐸𝐸𝐾𝐻 solution. Which I think we were very inspired by as an organization that focuses on making sort of mythic type content to get us to take the future seriously, like monuments, and, believing in the power of stories. But the idea behind the 𝐸𝐸𝐾𝐻 concept is that you genetically engineer cats that glow in the presence of radiation. And then you release them into the world. You make sure they become endemic. And then you seed a story that says if a cat glows, it's very bad, get away from that area. But you basically create a powerful myth and a cultural element.
What? All through story, right?
Yeah, your story, myth. Because you look at like what are the oldest things we have? They're myths.
Mm-hmm.
We have, Aboriginal stories that go back, over 10,000 years. Myths about, islands that exist off the coast of Australia that used to have a land bridge, and they have a myth about how, this event happened, this mythical event happened, and then the island got turned into an island. And we just figured out recently, we go back to the archaeological record, we're like, oh my God, that's describing a real thing that happened. This means this is a historical oral tradition that goes back that long. So it's truly the oldest continuous things we have are stories. And that's a big part of how we think about our mission is how do we create these stories that hopefully can allow for more civilizational continuity. It's a long detour.
That's okay.
Back to what's on the disc. So yeah, this is my favorite sort of design element of the disc is it has the 8 most spoken languages in the world, and they're spiraling in. And what they say is, this is an archive of the language of the world, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it's microscopic. And what's so cool about that is even if you don't speak any of these languages, you could look at this disk and say, oh, look, it looks like there's some little scratches on it. It might be some sort of symbolic system. I'm reading it. Oh, it's getting smaller and smaller. And at some point, you're going to lose the ability to read it. And you're like, hold on, let me grab a microscope. You're going to grab it, or, let's grab some magnification device and read it to the end. And then you turn it around, and what looks like a bunch of glitter actually becomes revealed as a bunch more pages of text. So you've communicated without sharing any language with someone. Go get your microscope,
Yeah.
which is like so cool.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was really,
Yeah.
I
It's like a direction without a direction. So we're assuming that, I mean, I guess there's always been a form of magnification if we think about, any type of distortion through something. That we are relying on the ability to magnify.
Yeah. I mean, so 100-fold magnification is required to sort of see the pages, which is, a certain level of technological sophistication, but one that, potentially would have been available during ancient times. Like all of the technology was there to polish glass down into
True.
curved
True.
pieces.
And much more.
Yeah, yeah. So you look at devices like the Antikythera mechanism in ancient Greece. It's like, yeah, that's pretty sophisticated. It was like a
That's
computer.
really sophisticated. It's like 2,000 years old, right?
Yeah. So you can imagine that, polished glass at a, concave or convex, thing. It doesn't require massive engineering knowledge. It
Yeah.
requires some material skills, but that is really it's an important aspect of how we design all of our projects. So, the 10,000-year clock is all gears that are basically at Antikythera level. It's like,
Right.
it's technology that very much can be understood by looking at it. Going back to your example of the iPhone, and looking at a black screen, it's like this is classic digital dark age stuff. The clock we're designing is 500 feet tall, and it's all gears. There's no digital computer in there. So you could look at it long enough and you can figure out how it works. You watch it and you're like, okay, that gear turns that, and that goes up that shaft. And like you can just follow it along. And if something is broken, you can fix it.
Yeah.
It's maintained.
Yeah.
Uh, if your iPhone dies, y- you could be there for a billion years staring at it. You're not like, it's literally a black box.
Yeah.
It can't, it requires a lot of technological sophistication to understand what's going on.
It does. Just for anybody who doesn't know what the Antikythera mechanism is, it is the world's oldest computer, essentially. It was found in a shipwreck off Greece quite a few years ago now, and it is a very sophisticated mechanism that actually was used to. It was in alignment with the planets and the stars. It was like a recreation of the solar system, right? Am I right in saying that? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was used for navigation
Yeah.
and from.
Yeah, and they didn't get it all right. They didn't get all the planets right, but nor would they or should they with a 2,000-year-old, ability to look up into the stars. Absolutely fascinating. You've got to look that up. Anybody who is interested in this type of thing. So the 10,000-year clock takes on that vein, and these nickel discs, they hold so much information. They hold so much information. Where will they be, or are they? Where are you at with the project?
So going back to one of your original questions of like, how do you do this? How do you store information for long periods of time? And one of the principles we discovered is basically open source. When information is private or rare, it tends to be destroyed. People put it in little walled gardens, and those gardens burn.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas when something is freely available, there tend to be a lot of copies. And there's this archiving principle called locks, um, LOCKSS. It's an acronym. And it's lots of copies keep stuff safe.
Love that.
Yeah. So this is like you want something to be preserved for a long period of time, make as many copies as you possibly can. So we made three different sets of Rosetta discs, two sets of the full size, and then one that's a sort of wearable necklace that people can wear around as a pendant. And that version is still available. People are interested in Rosetta.
Me?
There's this pendant. You can go to our website, longnow.org. Um, and they're available there. Um, and yeah, so we ended up, basically they were expensive to make, and they were, some portion of them were basically if you donated a larger amount of money, you could get one. But we also made sure to put them in different, cultural institutions. So, major university libraries. And then my favorite place we put them is basically is out into space. So there was a mission called the Rosetta mission. It's a European Space Agency, and they were doing a sort of Google vanity search to see, like, I wonder what else is called the Rosetta Project, and they found our project. And we're like, well, this is too good to be true. Um, Got in contact with us, and we ended up giving them a disc to put on their lander, which was the first lander to land on a comet. So, comet 67P.
Yes, I just read about this.
Yeah. So, it's totally cool. I mean, it took them, I think, like over a decade. Or maybe
Yes,
like
to get there, and they
yeah.
didn't they take samples from the comet as well when they got there, as well as putting something on it, or maybe I'm thinking of two separate projects, but
There's a more recent one
right.
that is getting samples. The lander, um, you know, had a hard time landing. It's on there, but I don't think the complicated machinery made it. But it's totally cool. We have this off-world archive. We also have another archive that's on the moon. S- yeah, so it's like really, cool to get some copies out there into the solar system. Um,
How did the one on the moon get there, and when was that? Don't
uh,
worry.
Pull up the specific details of that mission. It was a few years ago. But yeah, it was one of the moon missions.
Wow.
Uh, that was someone sending an artifact to the moon.
So there's a Rosetta disk on the moon. There's one on a comet.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's insane. And what about out in the ether, out in the wild? Isn't there anywhere? I'm just thinking of if the institutions crumble, or the museums fall by the wayside. They say that we could have had civilizations that had full infrastructures, but we would never know because that type of material just crumbles after a while. And I know that nickel discs are persevering, but I'm just wondering if there's deep underground or in some kind of silo or anywhere else that they might be.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of the idea of giving them to individual
Right,
people.
right.
Part of the we want in the institutional realm. Some of them we kind of want to get lost a little. So,
Yeah.
researching the clock, we learned a lot about what are the types of things that survive for a really long period of time. And there's a few trends that really emerge. One is sort of long-term cultural institutions. You look at
Right.
Trinity College, Harvard.
True, true, true.
These are the Vatican. These are like multi-thousand year orgs that have continuity, and are set up to sort of preserve knowledge for long periods of time. So those are some of the oldest things, in the middle of cities, usually. And then there's another class of things that are kind of lost and forgotten and rediscovered. So, Angkor Wat, the Dead Sea Scrolls, things that are just, if you want something to survive, make sure everyone forgets about it for a couple thousand years. It's
Right.
like one of their best bets. Put it in the middle of nowhere. Um, so that's where, giving it to individual people can be really,
Yeah. I'm
you
thinking
know,
of the papyrus, um, that that were being found within the tombs in Saqqara, uh, more recently in the last couple of years, completely preserved, mile long, hidden out of the way, and and I just love the idea of them being randomly taken out into the world by people. Are there any left? Is this still ongoing, or is that done? They've all been made. They're all out there, apart from the necklace.
um, the necklace is the current edition that we have, that we're putting out there in the world. It has this interesting idea of like, oh, if you have this thing that people wear and care for and stuff, it has
Now,
this utility that potentially makes it, more powerful than just an object that sits and gathers, dust on a bookshelf, perhaps.
100%. It's funny actually. A piece of jewelry that was given to me that had no initial meaning, but I knew it was from a grandparent of sorts, and then went on to ancestry.com and did my whole family tree and found a picture of my great great grandmother on there wearing the same brooch.
Wow, that's
All
so
of a
cool.
sudden, this had so much power. This had so much story around it. And I think things like jewelry, they do get passed down, they do get passed on, they endure through generations. So that's an absolutely fantastic idea. I'm going to get one. I'm so getting one of these.
Yeah, so it's that's the version that we currently have. I think we're open to making more full size ones in the future. There's definitely demand. People write us all the time wanting for more.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean there's the linguistic data that's on the disk itself, but then there was a lot of information that we couldn't fit on the disk, in gathering all this information. And that sort of spun off into its own project called Panlex, which was concept is kind of a universal translation engine. So, for a very long time, up until a couple of years ago, things like Google Translate only worked for the, you know, dozen, maybe 2 dozen most spoken languages in the world. It really wasn't good at getting that long tail of, the many thousand other languages that are spoken. So we we got grants. We had a whole team of linguists that were working on basically creating, sort of synthesizing different dictionaries from different languages and then putting them into a sort of computer parsable database so that you could translate across all of these
Right.
languages. So if you had a really rare, spoken, really rare language that was only, one that language to French dictionary existed, you would encode that entire dictionary and then you translate from French to English. And so,
Right.
you know, make a couple different hops. Um, so that language was, or that project was working and very active for a long time, and then eventually wound down. But all that data is still out there, and that data very crucially got sort of ingested by all the sort of major web crawlers. But we eventually realized that we couldn't really compete with, you know, nor was it worth trying to do what Google Translate was doing.
No.
Given the data set and their like machine learning and just the capital they have to like put towards things like that.
Mm.
Um, so the larger data set ended up becoming very important as a sort of open source linguistic archive and something that could be absorbed by all these other entities that were really working on universal translation as the goal, which with AI we seem very, very close to, if not
Yeah.
there. It's good. There's gonna be a long tail of smoothing it out, but something that was pretty science fiction even a decade or two ago,
Is
and you
now
can in and get live real time translation is effectively
you,
here.
you can even talk and it will change your lips into the language.
Yeah, no. So it's really cool to see something that when we started this project was kind of, it was something that was in sci-fi, right? It was
Right.
in Star it was in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, right? Like the Babelfish. And it's like now this sort of
Yeah.
we're living in that world and being able to sort of contribute some of the more rarefied data to that is really cool.
This is blowing my mind, honestly. I just love this topic so much. It's just so exciting. It's just so exciting to hear. I wanted to kind of start to close off this with a couple of questions for you. The first is if we can just imagine even like, I don't know, 500 years into the future, right? 500 years, which is actually a relatively short period of time when we think about this and the longevity of this. And someone finds, maybe it could be their part, a necklace is passed down to them, and they look at that necklace. What do you want them to feel from accessing this sacred information?
We want people to know that people in the past cared about them
Mm.
and were thinking about them.
Mm.
And, we're going to leave some pretty intense legacies for the future, right? In
Yeah.
all likelihood, they're not going to love us, um, where we are
Right.
economically right now.
Right.
Uh, and, I think it's really important that people understand that it wasn't everyone, that there was many, if not most, who really didn't want this to go that way and were fighting for, you know, the beautiful diversity that exists on this planet, whether it's biological or linguistic or cultural. Like there's so many people who cared about it and were working on projects and trying to preserve it.
That's incredibly poignant. And if we think about that at the highest level, if we think about our historical past and how we feel about our ancestors at certain periods of time, yeah, you're right. They could not like us very much. But to have some thread, some marker that we did care, that we were trying to do something about it, that we were thinking ahead into the future and we did care about those people, I think that's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. And a legacy, that word legacy, I think is a really key word here. And if anybody's moved by this, aside, I guess, from maybe buying a necklace or contributing ideas of how this could be brought forward, is there anything else people might be able to do in their day to day, within their cultures, within their environments that makes this a conscious thing for them?
Yeah. I mean, I will say I've been talking about the Rosetta Project almost the entire time, but we have a bunch of other amazing projects. Check us out at longnow.org. We also have a membership program where people can join. You get connected to a whole world of long term thinking,
Wow.
and out member newsletters. Uh, we've been hosting a lecture series since 2003. We're one of the first podcasts where we bring thinkers from all around the world to talk about long term thinking in their discipline. If you're interested in all of the different sub threads of long term thinking, from everything from fire management to economics, it's like we've had this beautiful catalog of over 300 talks on these topics. Um, there's also a Long Now London.
Is there?
Yeah, yeah, and that they'll meet up occasionally at a pub, from what I understand. But will also chalk the Uffington white horse,
Yep.
one of the glyphs. So they'll go every year on a little pilgrimage to sort of re-chalk it, so to maintain it. So a very cool, like, active, if you happen to be, local to that area, thing you can do to preserve a multi-thousand year,
Wow.
artwork from, one's own heritage. So if you have listeners in that area, that's one I do highly
That's
recommend.
actually not, that's in Sussex, right? The Uffington horse.
Think so? Yeah.
Yeah, that's, this is my county. So,
I mean,
yeah,
that's one. But in general, independent of law now, learn about the cultures that have existed in your local area, be curious, learn about the languages that were spoken there. Try to figure out how to capture some of that embedded knowledge local to where you are. Um, we're really lucky to be living in a time where that type of knowledge is being revitalized and held on to and nurtured, and linguistic communities are growing. Ones where the grandparents didn't teach the parents the language, and the grandkids are like, no, 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 we want we want that language, and they're being, like, local schools are starting to bring endangered languages back. So there's so many local initiatives if you dig down around preserving linguistic and cultural legacies, and all and all you have to do is just sort of poke around, and you'll find them.
I think that's really exciting. I've also interviewed someone from the local area who specialises in historical folklore and myth and legend from my local area, which then got me more into that. So I think it is, wherever you are, there is always stuff to dig into, and it's really exciting, and it's, super interesting as well, and can be of huge benefit. Thank you so much.
Both, like, to the culture and also, like, to yourself, like, being able to walk around, around, and, like, the stories that exist around them, like, it's just, like, it's intensely gratifying.
It is, and there's a real connection to land and self and culture and rooting and all of those sorts of things which make us human, which is why I was so honoured that you said yes to speaking to me in this penultimate episode of this season, because I've gone right from the depths of the ancient past, from terms of our human history, right now to the future and what that means for story from a human perspective. So thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on Words That Change Lives, Stories in Our DNA. We'll link all the links so that if anybody is interested in finding out more, that they can do that. But thank you so much for talking with me today.
Of course. Thank you.